Hello, and today we're going to be focusing on the third time period from 1750 to 1900 in preparation for the AP World History exam. So the first unit deals with revolutions, and this is Unit 5 of the AP World Curriculum. The basic idea is that between 1750 and 1900, the Enlightenment, political revolutions in the United States, France, Haiti, and Latin America, the development of nationalism, social movements such as abolition, feminism, and increasing suffrage, and the Industrial Revolution dramatically challenged traditional paradigms. Now, that statement is a mouthful, but in terms of what we're looking at for this unit, we're looking at how intellectual revolutions, political revolutions, social revolutions, and economic revolutions challenged traditional ideas that had been established for a long period of time. So when you think of these different things, think of how they challenge the way people either thought, the way people ran government, the way society was organized, or the way the economic systems function. So when we look at our first topic, we focus on the Enlightenment, which we would also refer to as the developments of liberalism. So we have to start this with the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution laid out this idea, laid out this premise that the world, the universe, operated according to natural laws. In other words, there weren't any supernatural spirits at work that were making things function in the world. The world functioned according to natural laws that could be observed and expressed mathematically. Now, some of this, or a lot of this, is founded within the Islamic world, and the knowledge of the knowledge of mathematics and science that came from the Islamic world to the Western European world. And if you remember, the Islamic world had also preserved a lot of the Greek ideas that are going to come to be challenged by the scientific revolution, but serve as the foundation for a lot of this experimentation and inquiry that becomes the basis for the scientific revolution. Now, in the Enlightenment, there's four significant philosophers that are worth knowing. One is Adam Smith, and what Adam Smith does is he challenges the idea of mercantilism, of this heavy, regulated form of the economy. And mercantilism is based on the idea that there's fixed wealth in the world, and therefore, to protect your interests, you have to regulate trade so that the trade balance is always in your favor. Adam Smith argued that you could create wealth. In other words, you can enlarge the pie that everybody's eating from. And Adam Smith argued that the best thing to do was to allow people to act on their own free choice, on their own free will. Because if people acted according to their free will, then they would make choices that benefited them first and foremost. And if those people are benefiting, then all of society ultimately benefits. So Adam Smith lays out an argument for what we call laissez-faire economics, this idea of the government not regulating the economy as heavily as mercantilism suggested. The other thing Adam Smith said was that when individuals are competing with each other, they end up benefiting society as a whole. If I have multiple businesses competing with each other for my business, they're going to end up keeping prices lower and they're going to make the product better. So the product is going to be cheaper and it's going to be of higher quality because they want me to buy their product. And that ends up benefiting me, the consumer. So the second one is John Locke. John Locke challenges the political notion of the right of the government, the absolute right of the government to rule over the people. If you remember the concept of divine right, that you have rulers who are appointed by God to rule over everyone else, and there should be no questioning of it. What John Locke said was that there's a social contract involved in government, that people give up their natural rights in order to have security and stability. But if the government goes beyond their charge, which is what the people put them in charge of, so in other words, the people create government within boundaries. They limit government to protect freedoms. If the government starts becoming tyrannical or start ignoring these ends, then John Locke says the people have the right to withdraw their permission and to create a new government or to alter the established government. And of course, we'll see this play out in the Declaration of Independence. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he talked about this idea of what we called the general will. And he's going to take things a little bit further with the social contract, where he says the government merely needs to reflect the will of the people, and that the government is just an apparatus of the people to carry out the people's will. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is different in the sense that he argues that human beings by nature are meant to be free, and that society has chained this freedom, that society has limited this freedom, and that in order to promote the most freedom possible, government needs to bend to the will of the people and become an expression of what he called the general will. And Mary Wollstonecraft is going to challenge the notion of patriarchy. She's going to challenge that notion that women are less than men, that women are less capable intellectually than men. Wollstonecraft famously said that men are biologically stronger, but that's the only basis for superiority. Otherwise, in every other way, men and women are equal. And therefore, according to Wollstonecraft, women should have greater political and economic opportunities within society. Of course, she's going to become the basis for the feminist movement that's going to come later. Now, these Enlightenment ideas are pretty potent because they are challenging a lot of the traditional ideas of the 17th century and of the 15th century. And these Enlightenment ideals are going to spread because of two reasons. One, they spread because of the printing press. The printing press allows these ideas to be published and spread easier and quicker and cheaper than we would have seen books done before. Second, because of imperialism that's going to come later in the 19th century, these liberal ideas are going to gain traction across the globe. In a way, one of the greatest exports Europe has ever had are these liberal ideas that are rooted within the Enlightenment. And they're going to become the basis for change, especially throughout the 20th century, throughout the globe. Now, what happens is the Enlightenment is going to provoke questions of existing practices. And this is what we refer to as the echoes of the Enlightenment. One, the concept of deism. Deism is going to suggest that there's a God who created the earth, who created the universe, but then stepped away from his creation. And now the universe runs on its own according to these natural laws. So in other words, God is an architect, but otherwise God does not take an active role in the world today. That's the basis for deism. And you can understand how this might challenge some institutional religions as we go along. Second, the abolition of the abolition of slavery and the end of serfdom. If you go with the idea that people have natural rights, then you can't justify this system of labor. You can't justify the idea that one person can own another person and still have this idea of natural rights. So slavery comes under attack from the Enlightenment principle of natural rights. But slavery also comes under attack from religious quarters throughout Europe, which argues that it's just against God's will. But then you have a third one, which is the economic argument, which basically says constraining labor, forcing labor to stay at one spot doing the same thing, limits the potential growth of the economy. In other words, we want labor to be able to move freely, and we want labor to be able to go where it is in demand. And that becomes one of the stronger arguments at the time against slavery. In other words, people who started to abandon slavery, it wasn't because they had a moral awakening, it's because they started to see the economic inefficiency in the system. So the British are going to begin the process of abolishing slavery throughout the early half of the 19th century, throughout, not just in Britain, but throughout their empire. And as the British Empire expands, that means more of the world is abolishing slavery. And once slavery gets abolished within a society, very rarely do we see it return to institutionalized slavery. Now, serfdom, which is another practice that was popular throughout Europe, starts to come to an end as well for the same economic reasons and moral reasons. The idea of serfdom is a very economically inefficient idea. You want labor to be able to move around freely. So bringing an end to serfdom is going to be seen as a mark of a modern society. And Russia is the big one. In 1866, Russia is going to abolish serfdom And that's part of their economic reforms to try and remake Russia into a modern economy. Then, and this relates back to Wollstonecraft, we have the idea of feminism, which is creating greater political and economic opportunities for women. And one of the big causes of feminism is to secure the right to vote for women, what we call women's suffrage. And then lastly, the increased suffrage movement. So, in other words, more people are getting the right to vote. So, as we start to see this Enlightenment idea saying that this should be that government should be a reflection of the social contract, that people enter into a social contract, and government needs to respond to the will of the people. There's an argument then that more people should be able to vote in order to reflect the people's will. And of course, your right to vote is really limited to property owning men, and then it becomes to men, and then it becomes to women after World War One. So that's kind of your generic flow of the development of suffrage. But the increasing movement for more people to vote is based in the Enlightenment. So then we get to political revolutions and nationalism. Now, here's the thing. With each of these revolutions, you don't need to go crazy understanding every single event that takes place in the revolution. So with the American Revolution, you want to understand that a lot of this is rooted within John Locke. So the liberal ideas of social contract. And for the Americans, this transforms into no taxation without representation. The argument is that Parliament's putting taxes on us, but we have no say in this. So that's a violation of social contract. And the Declaration of Independence is itself a reflection of the John Lockean principles. When the dust settles from the American Revolution, we have a constitutional system that puts limits on the government. And that way it's very much based out of the Enlightenment. And then we have a Bill of Rights that go further to really spell out the rights that are protected from government interference. However, the society itself is still going to reflect a lot of stuff before the revolution. Slavery will persist. The outsized political party power of the property owners will exist, and the limits on women will continue to persist. So what you want to understand with these revolutions is that the causes, how are they rooted within the Enlightenment, and the results, how much of them truly reflect the Enlightenment. So the French Revolution, you have the French Revolution starting initially over economic reforms to deal with an increasing financial crisis. And as a consequence of these increasing reforms, there's a call to remake the French society that's going to reflect the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the idea of equality is going to be heavily emphasized. And this is going to root itself within Rousseau. As we go along in the French Revolution, there's a desire for government to reflect the people's will and for society to be remade to emphasize the virtue of equality to the detriment of anybody who is doing anything that would advance inequality. They would be arrested, guillotined, they would meet a very quick end. Now, when it's all said and done, when the dust settles from the French Revolution, we end up with a society that has more property owners, which is an Enlightenment concept, the right to property ownership. So we have more property owners. We have a decreased power of the church, which again reflects an Enlightenment value. But we do have a return to a monarchy, albeit the monarchy is not as absolute as it once was. In the Haitian Revolution, you have to understand the Haitian Revolution within the context of the French Revolution. The French Revolution said liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the people within the colony of Saint Dominica, there it is, said, well, we're French citizens, therefore we have those same rights. And since 90% of the island was an enslaved population, these 90% rose up basically calling for equal rights for themselves. So in a way, the Haitian Revolution was probably the most Enlightenment-based one of them all, because they're emphasized on the abolition of slavery. Now the leader there is Louverture, and Louverture is a a former enslaved African who leads this revolution. Now, there's a lot that happens in the Haitian Revolution where even though the Haitians are released from enslaved status, the government, the new government says, well, we still need you working on the sugar plantations, which is not something that the population is crazy about. So with the Haitian Revolution, however, we see the creation of a republic, which is an Enlightenment virtue, and we see the abolition of slavery, which is connected to a virtue of the Enlightenment. Latin America, a lot of this is emphasized on rejecting mercantilism. So what the Creole class saw was limitations on the government, limitations by the Spanish government on their economic freedoms. And Bolivar is going to write in the Jamaica letter about how these restrictions and regulations are holding the Creoles back from enriching themselves, from making their lives better. And so he calls for a revolution. And the South American countries are going to revolt. They're going to reject the Spanish. Brazil are going to reject the Portuguese, but that's a little bit different. But what we call South America, except for Brazil, kind of follows this Bolivar movement, along with a man named San Martin. Now, what happens is that after the revolution, we still have a powerful Catholic Church throughout South America. We still have this racial subdivision of classes. If you remember the La Castas concept from the last unit, we still have that persisting, where the power is sitting in the hands of the landowners. And we still have a strong sense of patriarchy, where men are the ones who enjoy privilege and access, and women are reduced to more second-class status. And the other thing to keep in mind with South America is instead of unifying into one state, you have the development of these different nation states that kind of separate the political power and presents its own challenges following in the 19th century. When we get to nationalism, you have to remember that nationalism, there's a lot of different ways to understand nationalism, but the way I want you to is this idea of belonging to a group that's based on common ethnicity, common history, common language. So the idea, and this really takes off in the early 19th century, is to create nations that are based on that shared heritage. Because the idea is that when these group of people come together, they can do much more together than they can do individually. Now, this nationalism is going to have a major ramification throughout the 19th and 20th century. It's going to lead to the unification of states such as Germany and Italy. Is going to lead to the creation of new states that are breaking away from diverse empires, such as the Greek country breaking away from the Ottoman Empire. And nationalism for empires like the Ottomans is going to become the kiss of death, because the Ottoman Empire is going to start losing control of their various nationalist populations. So now we go to the big one, which is the economic one, the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution begins, you usually use 1750 as your beginning point. And the Agricultural Revolution is important. So when I say Agricultural Revolution, it's not to be confused with what we call the Neolithic Revolution, which is another agricultural revolution. The Neolithic Revolution, which happens 8,000 years ago, is when human beings figure out how to cultivate crops. This creates an increased food supply that can sustain a larger population. In the 16 and 1700s, the agricultural revolution is where we see agricultural innovations, such as seed drills, crop rotation, other forms of planting food and methods of farming. So I use the term agricultural revolution, but it's a bit of a misnomer, because the idea is that these are agricultural innovations. And these innovations do the same thing that all innovations do. They allow for the support of a larger population because more food can be grown and cultivated. Now, the other thing to mention is that this agricultural revolution is accompanied with what we call the enclosure movement, where large landowners start to take land previously used by the common people and started to bring it under their control as a way of commercializing farming. What this does is it kind of pushes the small farmers off their land, makes it tough for very small farmers to exist, and it pushes them to the factories. And that's the big thing about the impact of the agricultural revolution is with this growing population, you have more of a source for cheap labor that can go into the factories and fuel the labor needs of the Industrial Revolution. Second, the Industrial Revolution is going to begin in Britain, and it's going to begin with the textile industry. So basically, the mechanization of the textile industry is the beginnings of industrialization. Now, there's a lot of inventions like the spinning jenny and the flying shuttle that's going to drive this industrial or this textile industry. But the big thing to understand is that workers are using machines to spin thread in order to meet the demands of the textile industry. This isn't just a revolution in the type of machines they are using, but it's also a revolution in the types of power that is being used. We go from human power and animal power to water power, and then eventually to steam power. And once we start entering into steam, we're unleashing a whole new potential of power that's based out of fossil fuels. Digging up coal, using that coal to generate the steam, burning the coal, generating steam, is where we begin to transition to a fossil fuel-based industry or a fossil fuel-based economy. And that's going to, of course, have ramifications for everything in the 19th and 20th century. So the big question is, why Great Britain? Well, first, they have the mineral resources. That coal I was talking about becomes vital to the Industrial Revolution. There's coal all throughout Great Britain. Iron deposits are very important too. And Great Britain is just sitting on top of iron deposits. So some of it is just what Great Britain had in their backyard. But the other thing is that Great Britain had colonies, and they could access natural resources from those colonies to sustain the Industrial Revolution. They also had markets from these colonies where they could sell the goods that they were making. Britain itself has rivers all over the place, and what these rivers do is they create a natural infrastructure that allow for the transportation of goods and resources from one part of the island to another. They also have strong navy fleets, and these strong fleets can promote trade and protect the movement of resources across the seas. So it allows Britain to connect with the world in a much safer way. Think back to the first unit of this course, and one of the ideas, or the second unit of this course, one of the ideas is that trade can increase when there's a strong, stable government there to make things safe. And that's what's happening here. The British fleets are making trade safe. Then we have the laws that protect private property. So if I'm doing something that is economically beneficial to me, I want to make sure I reap all the rewards. So laws that protect both private property in the sense I get to keep what I make, and the patent system which protected intellectual developments becomes vital to encouraging people to take risks. And then you also have just a growing population and urbanization. These factories end up becoming the basis for a lot of these cities. And you have people moving from the countryside to the cities, and they are going to provide the cheap, unskilled labor that industrialization always needs. And then you have political stability. Simply put, Britain's not having revolutions in the 1700s. In a way, Britain has had their revolutions and their conflicts. By 1750, the British society is extremely stable. And when you have stable societies, you tend to have economic growth. And then we get to the idea that industrialization just doesn't stay in Britain. It starts to spread throughout the globe. Initially, it goes to France, Germany, and Belgium. And France, Germany, and Belgium, they're late to the game because of all the revolutions, from the French Revolution to nationalistic revolutions to the Napoleonic Wars. There's all this disruption in the early part of the 19th century. So Britain is industrializing while Europe, continental Europe, is going through a series of conflicts and disruptions. But once they get through that, starting in about the 1830s, 1840s, we start seeing them copying a lot of what Britain does. And they start to bring industrialization to their countries. Now, the great benefit is that they don't need to come up with a steam engine. They can just hire somebody from Britain to explain it to them. And that's going to give them a little bit of a step up and allow them to proceed a little faster. In the United States, industrialization is supported by the influx of East European immigrants. So when we look at the influx of immigrants, and now we're talking later 19th century, they help to provide that source of cheap labor that industrialization requires. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the US government is going to partner and support, but they're not going to direct industrialization. So, for example, when private companies go to build railroads, the US government's going to give them favorable loans and give them a lot of leniency, to develop the land the way they want to. So there is a kind of a relationship that develops between government and private industry where the government is supportive of the private industry. But in Russia, the government is going to tell the private industry what to do. So in Russia, we're going to have much more of a state-sponsored industrialization, where the state is going to decree things. And that fits with the absolutism of the late 19th century of Russia. Japan represents a transition, where Japan transitions from their more feudalistic ways to a modern way in about the 1870s. And what Japan is doing is they're conducting a state-sponsored industrialization, but their motivation is different than Russia. What Japan is trying to do is prevent themselves from being overtaken by Western society. So in this way, the Japanese industrialization, which is based out of the Meiji reforms, is motivated at keeping Japanese tradition in place and allowing Japan to maintain its independence by becoming a more modernized state. And then finally, we see that there's a shift in manufacturing. So in the 1600s, 1700s, shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia was a big industry. By the 1700s going into the 1800s, that is shifting over to Europe. And the shipbuilding industry of India and Southeast Asia begins to decline. Ironworks in India are also going to decline. So India has a lot of iron deposits, but they never industrialize the way Britain does. And a lot of that is that Britain kind of shut down the development of iron works and iron mining within India. And then lastly, textile production in India and Egypt is not going to compete with the British textile production because the British are going to impose rules and regulations during this time of imperialism on both India and Egypt. So what ends up happening is India and Egypt cultivate the cotton. The cotton is going to be exported to Britain, which is going to be turned into the threads that make the textiles. The textiles are going to be produced, and those British textiles are going to be resold in India and Egypt. And a lot of that stems from the imperialistic relationship of Britain to those two countries. Then we take a look at, and I see that I made a mistake. So this should be letter G and this should be letter H. I apologize. Technology in the industrial age. So you have this idea of revolution in sources of energy, the coal revolution. And the coal revolution is going to unleash a new power source. And now we're using fossil fuels to drive the power. And we're still using fossil fuels today. And of course, the big invention is the steam engine. Now, the steam engine doesn't just power machines, but it also can power forms of transportation. And that's where you get the steamships and the railroads. Now, you can understand how both of these are going to allow for greater interconnection, and it's also going to encourage wider spread trade. It's going to allow goods and resources to transverse the economic system in a shorter amount of time and at a lower cost, which is just going to encourage more industrialization. Iron is going to be the metal of the first industrial revolution. And iron, this metal, is going to become the basis for what machines are made out of. It's going to become the basis of what the railroad tracks are made out of. And then we have the second industrial revolution. And most of the time in US history, what you studied is actually the Second Industrial Revolution. The United States, Britain, and Germany are the leaders of this. We can also put Japan in this later. And what happens is a new um, innovation comes along called the Bessemer process. What the Bessemer process does is it removes the impurities from the iron to create a stronger metal, which is steel. And steel is going to become the new metal of use. And steel is a much more strong and sturdier metal, and you can do a lot more with it. So the second industrial revolution is going to be built on steel. Another fossil fuel is going to start to get developed called oil. And oil can be refined into petroleum. Oil can be used to power the machines. You know, if we start using gasoline, we can start using this fuel to power the machines. And this form of fossil fuels is much more powerful than coal. So we hit this point in the 19th century where coal is still being um, mined, but oil is being refined into fuel that's going to drive a lot of this industrial revolution. And then we have the advent of electricity. And electricity, you know, allows for major technological leaps. So the second industrial revolution provides a much heavier and more widespread industrial revolution. And usually when we talk about the industrial revolution, we're talking about this form of it. We also have new communications, such as the telegraph, the telephone, and radio. Now, we'll talk more about radio later, but the telegraph allows for instant communication over a long distance. And that's going to allow for news to spread much faster and for us to start seeing a more interconnected world. So all of this has an impact on global trade. Simply put, global trade is going to start to pick up speed. And it's going to allow for greater interconnection. It's going to allow for safer trade, faster trade, cheaper trade. And whenever you get those three things together, you get more trade. Now, what we do on a global level today blows this out of the water. It's apples and oranges in terms of quantity of trade, but the basic ideas are there. And then next, government's role in industrialization. So I referred to this earlier when I talked about the spread of industrialization. In Europe, you have the strong emphasis on what we call laissez-faire, where the government needs to stay out. However, you see other empires or other governments where the government tries very hard to direct industrialization. One example of this is in Egypt. Now, the Ottoman Empire controlled Egypt till about 1882. And in Egypt, you had a leader named Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but a political leader. And what he did was he kind of did his own thing within the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire may have technically controlled it, but Egypt was very much acting on its own. And one of the things that Muhammad Ali wanted to do was industrialize Egypt. So he puts in a series of reforms to get Egypt to industrialize. It has mixed results. In Japan, we have a much more successful story with the Meiji reforms, where basically the Japanese government decides under the emperor, who has increased his power, the shogun model of governing has been displaced, and now we have a central government. And that central government says, we're going to go study the West. We're going to study Germany, Britain, France, and the United States. And we're going to take the best that they have to offer and bring it back home and incorporate that into our society. In other words, we're going to remake our society by copying what we think is best from the Western powers. But we're going to keep this all under Japanese control. And so there you have a much more successful situation where a country industrializes. All right, economic developments and innovations. So another thing is that we get new financial innovations. Businesses get organized into corporations. And these corporations start to have a multinational, that comes later. But these corporations, in a sense, become seen as their own individual entity. And corporations can control many different layers of production, which can lead you to monopolies. This idea that one business controls either one part of the means of production, or they control all parts of the production. So if I control where the oil comes from. And if you want oil, you have to go to me. That's an example of what we call a horizontal monopoly. However, if I control the production, the acquisition of raw materials, the refinement of those raw materials into a product, and then the distribution of that product, that's another form called vertical monopolies. Whatever you understand about monopolies, understand this. We're now creating these businesses that have an extreme amount of wealth, an extreme amount of influence and power. And this brings me to the transnational companies. Now, we've had transnational companies before, such as the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. But now we're getting something different, where these private companies are kind of broken from the government. Because if you remember the East India Company, the government provided them monopolies and the government provided them charters. These transnational companies are basically acting as their own entities. They don't necessarily answer to one government. So a great example of this from the 19th century is Lipton Tea. So Lipton Tea owns land in India where tea leaves are being cultivated. They own factories and distribution points throughout the world. They have their fleet of steamships that carry the tea around. So Lipton Tea is going beyond just being confined to one nation. They're acting as a transnational company. Now today we would call these multinational corporations, but that's a slightly more developed concept of this. The MNCs are just a much more integrated and more complex form of these transnational companies. Banking and financial innovations also take off. And one of the big innovations is insurance. The idea that here I am engaging in an expedition and now a whole industry is going to develop that says, well, if you pay a little bit to us, we'll guarantee that if everything goes south, you can get your money back. So the insurance companies are banking on nothing happening. And if I get enough insurance customers, if I get enough customers, all the people who are paying into me, I'm going to be making more money in than I'm paying out to the few people who need it. So think about car insurance, for example. I mean, the number of people who never have an accident, far outweighs the number of people who have an accident. So the people who never have an accident are paying, and the insurance company is getting more money in than the money that they're paying out to the few people who do have accidents. So we have a whole new financial system. And Lloyd's of London is your first insurance company. Then we also have the growth of consumerism, this idea that with these cheap goods being flooding the markets, particularly in Europe, Japan, and the United States, we have a greater access to material goods. And in a way, today, we're just a very extreme form of that. But the other thing is that more people have more time to play. And this is going to lead to the growth of organized sports. So now that I start having more time to play, we start seeing leagues, professional leagues form, as well as youth leagues form. Professional leagues begin to form, and when we start getting into the late 19th, early 20th century, those leagues start to get stadiums, they start to sell tickets to the games, and sports, the idea of professional sports that we know and love today has its roots within here, which is a consumerism of sorts. And then we also have, with more leisure time, construction of buildings for this leisure. Theaters start to get constructed, restaurants start to get constructed, parks start to get constructed, all to accommodate this ability of particularly industrialized societies to engage in leisure. And in a way, we still are doing that. Now, of course, there are reactions to the industrial economy. One, labor is going to start forming within the factories, and this new labor class are going to have long hours, unsafe conditions, hard, dangerous work, and low pay. So we start creating a labor class that is based on this idea that they're supplying cheap labor and they're getting paid the least amount of money possible to provide that labor. Now, eventually what's going to happen is labor unions are going to form to push back against this. And the late 19th century into the 20th century, we see the growth of labor unions. Now, some of these labor unions are local. In other words, they just deal with the workers of Germany. Other labor unions take on a more international approach. And one such union movement is the International Workers of the World. And what they're calling for are better treatments of all workers across the globe. In other words, think of this as an international labor movement. Now, on the other hand, we have capitalism and much more of what we call corporate capitalism. This idea that the government should stay uninvolved in the economic affairs of a people. That's one thing. Capitalism also said, let the natural laws of the economy dictate prices and wages. So, in other words, if a company becomes a monopoly, that's just the way it worked out. You leave that alone. So, capitalism had a heavy emphasis on natural laws of economics, supply and demand, prices and wages being set at the lowest point possible, and laissez-faire economics. This form of capitalism is also mixing in with social Darwinism, which basically says the people who can should be allowed to succeed as much as possible. And if you fail, well, then there's something wrong with you, not the system. And that brings me to the alternative views of society, because there are other groups who say, no, people who fail are victims of the system, as opposed to victims of their own personal failings. And two forms of government economics is going to form. One called socialism. Socialism says that the government or some central apparatus, but usually the government, should take the production of a society and then distribute it more evenly amongst the society. So socialism is a form of redistribution. So you take the wealth that's being generated by a society, and instead of letting it go to, disproportionately to a small group of people, you distribute it more equally amongst a large group of people in order to assure that people are enjoying a reasonably good life. Karl Marx is going to take this a step further. Basically, he says that society is marching to what he called communism, a scientific socialism. And he said that what has happened is that the Industrial Revolution has created a working class and a landowning or the property owning class. The bourgeoisie is the property owners, the proletariat are the workers. And the workers are being so abused that eventually the workers would rise up in revolution, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and just take control of everything. So instead of a central government telling everybody what to do, the workers would be running the show on their own, working together as a community. And you would get rid of the concept of private property. You would have no need for government in the long run. So when you look at communist states today, you go, well, wait a second, why do they have such strong dictatorial governments? I would just say that their government uses the name communism, but is in fact a militant form of socialism. Now we get to the non-European nations' resistance to industrialization, because industrialization has a global impact. And you're going to have non-European nations that go, we have to respond to this. So one reaction is in the Ottoman Empire in the Tanzimat reforms, or the Tanzimat reforms. And these Tanzimat reforms are an attempt to modernize the Ottoman Empire, an attempt to get the Ottoman Empire to look and function more like the Western societies. This starts in about the 1830s. But there are segments throughout the Ottoman Empire, such as the Janissary, Islamic scholars, the Sultan himself, who feel that these reforms are dangerous to their interests and dangerous to their status. So they work against these Tanzimat reforms, and that creates a tension. In China, we have resistance to what's called the self-strengthening movement. And this is going to come largely from Confucian scholars who feel a threat to their status and their privilege. So when they see the self-strengthening movement come along in the 1880s, they work to undermine that movement and eventually derail it. And then in Japan, the Meiji reforms are a form of westernization. It's changing everything. And samurai warriors who enjoyed status in the feudalistic days of the Tokugawa shogunate, they're going to actively resist through revolt against this system. Now, with the Ottomans and the Chinese, those resistance movements successfully slow down the modernization efforts. In Japan, the samurai get defeated and the modernization moves forward anyways. So the last couple things, wow, there's a lot. Society in the industrial age. So we have the creation of urban areas. Cities are growing both in population and in pollution. We also have a new class structure where we're starting to see some groups of people who are making their money off of managing the factory. So what we might call white collar workers. We also see this idea that in this class structure, we have a new middle class emerging that are like lawyers and bankers and managers within the corporate office, where they're not working directly in the factories, but rather they're engaged in business supporting these factories. And that creates what we would refer to as the middle class. They're becoming property owners, they're becoming wealthy, and they're challenging the traditional landed nobility for power. But we also have a working class, what we would call blue-collar workers. Now we have farm work versus factory work. So the idea is that your factory work is being paid just as little, and the farm work is becoming even harder for an independent farmer to exist because the large farms are starting to take over. So you start getting this idea that there's work in the countryside, and now an increasing number of people working in the factory. Children are going to be employed because their little hands can be used in the machines, and that's going to provoke child labor laws. So now the government is going to have a role to step in and start regulating the labor of children. We also see women being used as labor sources because they can be paid cheaper, which is something that the factory owners wanted. And in fact, there's going to be labor laws that regulate the treatment of women. In Britain, there was a huge scandal about women working in the coal mines, without clothes on, pulling carts with crawling on all fours. When this came to light, there was a series of laws that got passed by Parliament to reduce this type of abuse of labor. Now, by our standards, we have much more integrated laws into our labor system than they did. But we start seeing the government take a role in trying to regulate these abuses. And then the other thing is that for women of the middle class and of the upper class, they begin to get exposed to this consumer society through advertising in particular to purchase things to make the home better. And there becomes a strong association of women and the home, especially with this middle class, upper class group, where the home is a reflection of the woman. And since industrialization is creating jobs where women don't need to work because their husbands can make a good wage, what's happening is we create a cult of domesticity. In other words, women are being heavily emphasized to take care of the home and to provide a home that's a reflection of the stability of the family. And then finally, the effect on the environment. We're starting to mine things, particularly coal, so we're starting to alter the environment. You're going to have deforestation. You're going to have all the beginnings of what we've always seen with the environment, where the environment is altered to suit the needs of the human population. Now, the last thing is just changing continuity, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of this. The basic idea is you want to see how the Industrial Revolution and all revolutions provoke change, but also elements of pre-revolution society continued. So with economic, we certainly see this shift to a manufacturing system. That's a change. We see artisans starting to lose their role in society because now machines can do the job of artisans. And there's going to be a lot of artisans who are going to resist that through sabotage of the machines because they see the machines as taking away their jobs. And then lastly, unequal distribution of wealth, that's a continuity. That's always been going on. So it's not like this suddenly was a new thing. Socially, physical labor is going to change. The idea of still doing physically hard work for the lower class, farming is hard work, factory labor is hard work. So there's still this emphasis on physical labor. But the idea that we create an assembly line where one person is doing one little job in the process, that represents a change. Because before, a typical laborer followed the product from beginning to end. Now the laborer is just in one stage of that production, and that's all they do. So that represents a change of the way we produce. The emergence of the middle class and the petite bourgeoisie is a social change. And the petite bourgeoisie are people who come from lower class backgrounds and are being paid a lower wage, who are hanging out and associating themselves with the middle class. So to give you an example, if I have a corporation of the 19th century, let's say Lipton Tea, and Lipton Tea has an office building, and in that office building are, men particularly, who are getting paid a good wage. They're lawyers. They specialize in drawing up contracts. They're managers. They're salesmen. All white collar jobs. Those people need secretaries, and they need typists, and they need file clerks, and they need people to move mail around. All of those people are what we call petite bourgeoisie. So the secretary is getting paid a lower wage, but she is associating herself with the middle class. That's her life. She's associating with this middle class. So she tries to dress like them. She tries to buy things like them. She tries to imitate them. And she has the ambition of moving up into that group. And then we have the wealthy class. What's happening is that there's a change, because being a factory owner, being a business tycoon, being the John Rockefellers, and being the Andrew Carnegies, you're becoming wealthier than the traditional wealth of the nobility. And then, of course, gender roles. Women are still treated as second-class citizens. Women are still subject to the lower-paying jobs and are still kind of seen as less than equal to men. And then, of course, politically, while we may have political changes, we still have the idea of strong central governments. Now, we go on to consequence of industrialization. So this is Unit 6. And this, we put a heavy emphasis on imperialism. So the basic idea is that this industrialization in Europe caused a need for access to resources and markets. This led to the development of overseas empires, this is what imperialism is, largely in Asia and Africa, as well as the development of export economies in Latin America. European technological advances supported this growth, though there were acts of resistance. So that's the big statement, that industrialization causes imperialism. And imperialism is part of this movement towards a global economy. And this global economy is going to take some underdeveloped nations and transform them into export economies, and is also going to encourage the movement of people, the migration of people, to serve as sources of cheap labor needed throughout the global economy. So one, we get to rationales for imperialism. How did the Europeans justify this movement towards imperialism? First, through nationalism. Basically the idea of we're in a big competition. If I, England, do not expand, France will expand instead, and France will have the advantage over me. So the nationalistic argument is that we have to do this in order to compete on an international level. Social Darwinism, which emphasized the hierarchy of races, placed the Europeans at the top. And the idea is that the Europeans see themselves as a superior people by nature, and that their natural superiority needs to be allowed to develop the world. In other words, there are parts of Africa and there's parts of the United States which can be more productive. And it's only if the Europeans get their hands on it that those lands will truly be developed to their full potential. Third, white man's burden, the idea that the Europeans had an obligation to spread civilization to everyone else, to bring them up into this new age. Religious missionaries are another motivation, this idea of spreading Christianity to save the souls of all of those people who never converted to Christianity. Now, we've had religious missionaries before, but now we have a government European governments that have a military to kind of help these missionaries out. So a lot of these missionaries, just to make this point, are going to be Protestant missionaries because England is going to be a driving force of this, as well as France. France, you'll have Catholic missionaries. But as Germany goes out into the world, they're going to send out Protestant missionaries. So since Germany and England are going to be big drivers of this, and the United States, there's three nations that are going to be driving an expansion, what we call imperialism. Their missionaries are going to reflect the religion of those three nations, which is largely Protestant in nature. And then lastly, to me, the biggest one, the economic motives. The need for raw materials to support the Industrial Revolution, such as palm oil. Palm oil is necessary to oil the machines and keep the machines lubricated that are working in the European factories. The need for new markets to sell these European goods. So as Britain is producing textiles, they need to sell these textiles to people beyond just the British border. So they're looking to sell it to the Chinese, to the Indians, to the Egyptians. They're looking to increase their markets. And then lastly, access to cheap labor. The idea that labor should be as cheap as possible. We're going to start seeing non-Europeans doing the labor in the mines, the labor in the plantations, and doing it at a very, very low wage, which of course is going to benefit the corporations that are running the show. So that brings me to state expansion. So the basic idea is you don't want to freak out about all of this, okay? Basically, when we look at Europe, they go into Africa and we have what's called the scramble for Africa. And a lot of this is rooted in the technology of industrialization. The Maxim gun gives the Europeans a technological edge. They can easily overwhelm defenses with this, early form of machine gun. Steamboats allowed for the Europeans to go against the rivers and to navigate the rivers of Africa. Usually the rivers of Africa flow out to the oceans. These steamships are going to allow the Europeans to go into the interior much more easily. And then the medical advancement of quinine, which is going to be an inoculation against malaria. Many European expeditions were wiped out by malaria. But quinine is going to allow these European expeditions to succeed, and get into the interior of Africa. Now, what happens initially is that the Europeans, it's not the governments going in, but rather European businesses. And these European businesses are going to start creating treaties with local tribes and local chiefs and local villages in order to acquire resources, to get cheap labor, and to gain access. So these treaties kind of give the European companies a foothold in Europe. Now, and a great example of this is what's happening in the Belgian Congo. So in the Congo, we have the Congo Free State, which is going to come in and start making treaties with local African villages, local African chiefs. And what's going to happen is that rubber, in particular, is going to be harvested, within the Congo. So there's a private business that King Leopold of Belgium is running. So King Leopold has this business interest, and the business is running the show. There's no Belgian government in the Congo. There's a Belgian business in the Congo. And we see rubber being heavily cultivated and harvested. The labor treatment is akin to slavery. You have Congolese who are getting their hands chopped off for not following through and meeting quotas of the amount of rubber that needs to be brought back. This produces an outrage in Belgium, and the Belgian government takes the Congo and makes it into a colony. And this is going to be a very common pattern where there's some type of European economic presence, and then a government comes in to protect that investment. And that's going to be a pattern we're going to see. Now, the Belgian Congo threatens a land scramble in Africa. And the European countries are in this competitive mindset, and this could easily provoke a European war. That's when the Berlin Conference happens in 1884, 1885, where the European powers sit down and they kind of break Africa up amongst themselves. And this prevents a European war, but it provokes the scramble for Africa. And from 1884 to 1914, within about 30 years, all of the African continent falls under European control, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia. Other than that, all of Africa is falling under European control. When we go to South Asia, which is going to be later India and Pakistan, we have the East India Company from Britain, who's doing something very similar. They're integrating themselves into the political nature of India. They're making treaties with local leaders, and they're expanding their presence. The 7 Years' War kicks the French competition out, leaving just the East India Company in control. Now, the East India Company is going to sit there and it's going to grow in its power and ability. And eventually, what's going to happen is the British government is going to take over after the Sepoy Revolt of 1857 threatens that economic investment. In East Asia, we have the Opium Wars. Again, British merchants are doing business in China. Now, up to this point, China's always enjoyed the economic advantage in this trade relationship. The power of trade is in China's corner because there's really nothing that Britain has that China wants, but China has everything that Britain wants. When opium gets introduced by British merchants, the trading relationship begins to change. Now there's a huge demand in China for a British good, opium. And the Chinese government will try and stop this, and this will provoke the Opium Wars that the British will win handedly because of the superior technology. And once that starts to happen, we get a new period of history of relationship between Europe and China, which is often called like the century of shame from a Chinese perspective. Because the Europeans begin to come in and establish the economic rules on China. And this is what we call the spheres of influence. So what happens is China is being kind of broken up amongst the Europeans, and the Europeans, they don't colonize China, but what they do is they exert a lot of economic influence in China. And now China is becoming, the Manchu government is nothing more than a puppet government of the Europeans. In Japan, we've talked about this enough. We have the Meiji reforms, which attempt to, well, not only attempt, successfully westernize and modernize the Japanese economy to make it more industrialized. We see railroads popping up throughout Japan. We see factories popping up throughout Japan. And we see Japan become an industrial power. And of course, industrialism leads to imperialism. So Japan begins a campaign of spreading throughout Southeast Asia. They take the island of Taiwan. They're going to take Korea. They're going to defeat Russia and China in wars. And Japan is becoming more and more of a military and political and economic presence in Asia. We'll see how that plays out later. Imperialism in Southeast Asia follows a similar pattern. The VOC, which is really the Dutch East India Company, had a significant presence in Indonesia dating back to the 1450s to 1750 stage. However, their presence there is so important that the Dutch government will take over what we call the Dutch East Indies at the time, and they will they will make that into a colony in order to protect their investments, their economic presence. Now today we call that region Indonesia, but at the time we call it the Dutch East Indies. The French will come into Indochina, which is basically the modern state of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And the French are going to establish control within this region for the same reasons, resources, cheap labor, so on and so forth. And the big one you want to focus on is that Vietnam is coming under the control of the French. And then Britain is going to go into the Malay Peninsula. So what is Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, which at the time is being, instead of Thailand and Myanmar, it's being called Burma and Siam. So Siam, Burma, those are colonies of the British. Today, we refer to them as Myanmar, which was Burma, and Thailand. And then you have the Malay Peninsula, which is basically Malaysia, where Singapore is. And they're going to become part of the British Empire, providing raw materials to the industrialized world of Britain. Australia and New Zealand is going to stand out a little differently because these are what we call settler colonies. So numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, we don't see a huge wave of Europeans settling into those areas. We see increased European control of those areas. In Australia and New Zealand, British or Europeans are going to show up and they're going to establish their own colonies and their own communities. Now, when the Europeans show up, they're going to start bringing in European diseases to previously isolated communities. And that's going to provoke something very similar to what we saw in the Columbian Exchange, where a lot of the natives are going to die off because of the exposure to European diseases. Not all of them, but a significant number. In the United States, we have this concept of the manifest destiny, where it was the God-given destiny of the American people to expand west and to cultivate it and to civilize it. And so this is going to provoke the expansion of the United States past the Mississippi all the way to the Pacific coast. The Spanish-American War is going to allow for the United States to expand its influence overseas, particularly in the Caribbean, by expanding influence over Cuba and Puerto Rico, and also in the Pacific, particularly in Guam and the Philippines. So now the United States is expanding its presence in both the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean, as well as across what we call the Western United States. On top of that, we should ask two more things. The purchase of Alaska in 1867, and also coming into Hawaii. Now, Hawaii, again, follows a similar pattern. An American business is going to set itself up there. It's going to be cultivating sugar plantations as well as fruit plantations. There's going to be a backlash from Hawaii nationalism. So the native Hawaiians are going to kind of resist this, which is going to lead the U.S. to annexing Hawaii, and eventually becomes our 50th state. But Hawaii is going to experience something very similar when to the Native Americans. When the Europeans begin to show up in the 1700s with the Cook voyages or the Cook expeditions, we have a previously isolated population being exposed to European diseases. And over the course of the next century or so, we're going to have a huge population decline of the native Hawaiians because of their exposure to these diseases. And then Russia's expansion really is more in the 1700s than the 1900s. But we just want to mention it. Their expansion is through Siberia, and then they'll come into Alaska. They also will go through some Pacific islands in the north. Now, what's different with Russia, their expansion into Siberia follows a similar pattern. It's a previously isolated population, gets exposed to Western diseases, and they die off. We have religion spreading into this area, particularly Orthodox Christianity, and we have the Russian people settling and developing agriculture within these regions. But Russia is going to sell off Alaska to the United States. Russia are going to lose a lot of those islands that are in the northern part of Asia to the Japanese. And so in a way, Russia's imperial expansion is going to be limited by other stronger states that are emerging, particularly the Japanese. So that's something just to keep in mind. Okay, so indigenous responses to state expansion. In other words, this didn't just happen easily. The Westerners didn't just come in and just take over. There's going to be resistance. So in the Americas, we have the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation is going to resist by going to the Supreme Court as the U.S. government is trying to displace the Cherokee people off their land. The Cherokee people will say, look, we have treaties, and the Supreme Court will support the Cherokee Nation. But then President Jackson will order their removal anyways, and we have the famous, or the infamous, Trail of Tears. The ghost dance is more of a militant response, because what happens is that there's the belief in Northwest United States that the ancestral spirits will drive out these American settlers. And the ghost dance was meant to hasten that along. Now, that resistance is going to lead to what's called the Battle of Wounded Knee. And that is going to be the end of the wars against the Native Americans. But the ghost dance represents a return to traditional beliefs in the face of these expanding times, or these changing times. And then the holiday Cinco de Mayo is an example of Mexicans resisting the French who are coming in 1862 to 1867. And on the 5th of May, there's a defeat of French forces that kind of prevent the French from consolidating their control in Mexico. It's not fair to say that this is Mexican independence, but it is a Mexican victory over the French, who are attempting to expand their control in the 1860s. So we go to South Asia, the Sepoy Rebellion, where you have the Sepoys are South Asians who serve in a military force for the East India Company. And a lot of these Sepoys resent the British presence because they feel that the British are undermining their local traditions and local religions. So there's going to be a violent revolt, a violent uprising in 1857 against the British. This eventually gets put down and the British government increases its control. And down the road, the Indian National Congress will come along. The Indian National Congress wants to demand a greater voice for the Indian people in the way the British government. In Southeast Asia, Vietnam, there's going to be plenty of resistance to the French from Vietnamese nationalist forces, which is going to continue through, into World War I, into the 20th century. But we also see the Philippine-American War. So in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. takes over the Philippines. But then when the U.S. tried to establish control of the Philippines, there's an uprising of the Filipinos against the Americans. And the Americans are going to fight a war to bring the Filipinos under control and to create more of a controlled territory. In New Zealand, the native people called the Maori are going to rise up in resistance to this encroachment of European settlers. Now, what's interesting is that the Maori not only fight back against the European settlers, but the Maori are also going to challenge them in courts, and there's going to be an attempt to kind of limit the expansion of the European presence and preserve the Maori tradition. And in a way, New Zealand down the road will come to a compromise between these two groups. In East Asia, such as China particularly, we have the Taiping Rebellion, which is a rebellion against the Manchu government, which is seen as a puppet government of the West, as well as against Western influences, particularly against opium. And the Taiping Rebellion also calls for the end of foot binding and greater rights for women. So we can see the Taiping Rebellion as both a nationalist movement, but also an anti-Western movement and a religious movement because it had a big theme of Christianity. The Boxer Rebellion that takes place in 1899 is an anti-Western backlash. It's a complete rejection of the Western presence by this secret society of the Boxers. Now, what's interesting about the Taiping and the Boxers is that both rebellions are put down by Western coalition forces. In other words, it shows that the Manchu can no longer effectively govern China. They have to rely on the West to intervene. And in 1911, there's a revolution of a nationalist party led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who's arguing for three principles: democracy, economic self-help, and nationalism. So what Dr. Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist party, called the Kuomintang, want to do is modernize China so that it can be an independent China. And they say in order to do this, we need to get not just rid of the Manchu emperor, but we need to abandon that system of dynastic government that's been going on for so many years. And then in Africa, we have many different forms of resistance. So I apologize, I'm having a tough time reading it. The Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa, is an Islamic movement to reject the Western presence, an attempt to create a Islamic-based government to resist the Western encroachment. In South Africa, we have the Xhosa cattle killing. So the belief was that, by killing the cattle, their spirits would basically drive out the Europeans. Again, going back to ancestral worship. And the Zulu Wars, where as the Europeans begin to expand north in South Africa, African tribes unify into one nation called the Zulu, and they fight back against the European encroachment. Samari-Tories War is another example of an Islamic-based war in West Africa against the French. And what's interesting about these three is that all three of them call, and actually the next one, the Mahdist Revolt, all four of them call on religion, traditional religions, to resist westernization. So, in other words, there's kind of a fallback to tradition to resist what they see as a corrupting influence. So, the Mahdist Revolt in the Sudan, what's significant about this is a religious based revolt against the British. But when the British come in, they unleash the Maxim guns. And there is a battle where it shows you the significant difference of technology, where a small British force defeats a larger, group of the Mahdists, and inflicts significant casualties just because of this technological edge. And in fact, that's why a lot of these resistance efforts are going to fail. It's because the British have the technological edge, as do the French. And that's also seen in the Ya Asante-Wa War, which is called the War of the Golden Stool, which is in the present state of Ghana. It's a nationalist resistance to the British presence. Now, these five, they're examples of resistance, and they're not easy for the Europeans to squelch. But the Europeans ultimately can squelch it because of the technological edge. In Ethiopia successfully resists the Italians because the Ethiopians get their hands on the Maxim guns. And once that technology is equal, the Ethiopians are able to preserve their independence through militant means. Then we look at imperialism in the global economic development. So one, the technology of the steamboat particularly allows for the growth of global trade. But the other thing is that some colonies, what they do is they start cultivating one or two crops that they know the industrial societies will buy. And it's not just the colonies doing it, but it's underdeveloped nations throughout the world. So for example, if I think of sugar plantations that are popping up throughout, the more climate zones, they're producing that, those societies are producing sugar for the purpose of selling sugar to the Europeans because they know the Europeans will buy the sugar. They may not even be controlled by a European country, but they're heavily influenced by the European economy. And that's what we call export economies. And export economies lead us to raw materials that are being cultivated in order to sell to the Europeans. Rubber, which is important in the manufacturing of products at this time. Palm oil, which is important to lubricate machines. And other various minerals, such as copper and tin, and guano, which is basically bat poop, which is a fertilizer to support agricultural developments. Copper is important for wiring as we get into more and more electricity. Tin is important as the canning industry. The ability to take tin cans and, preserve food within it, that's growing in the 19th century. So I need the tin to make the cans. Wherever the tin is, we're going to get mining operations. We're going to see this particularly throughout South America. Argentina, Brazil, Chile are the three big ones who develop export economies. And those export economies are going to lead to, a small group of people who are making a lot of money and a lot of people doing the physical labor. And the development of monoculture. So the idea is that as cash cropping becomes more and more emphasized, the environmental, the biodiversity gets limited. And what we have is one crop being emphasized as opposed to a diversity of crops. So now I have a whole society dependent upon the cultivation of one crop. And if that crop goes bad, that culture is screwed. Or if people stop wanting to buy the crop, that culture is screwed. And then when we look at economic imperialism, in a way, we're starting to go over some basic things that I just talked about. Economic imperialism is when, it's not direct political control, but the economy of the industrialized developed society is exerting a lot of influence over the underdeveloped regions. So the undermining of the Indian textile industry. So as the British increased their control over India, they put in laws to restrict textile production within South Asia. What that does is it protects the British textile factories from competition, and it undermines the Indian textile industry. Spheres of influence in China, I think that's pretty obvious, where the British, well, European and Japanese are putting in the economic rules of trade in China. Cash cropping throughout Africa, I think that's pretty obvious. That's been dealt with. Plantation economies in Hawaii. As Hawaii gets settled by the British and the American businesses and corporations, they bring in plantations, particularly fruit and sugar plantations. And banana republics in Central Africa or Central America, such as the United Fruit Company. So the United Fruit Company is going to create plantations in places like Guatemala, for example. And these companies are going to make sure that the government is friendly to them. And so literally these republics are based on these fruit companies exerting all the power. So when we say banana republic, what we're talking about is something republic in name, but in practice is being controlled by a very small group of people. And then we have the continuity of slavery within Africa. So even though abolition is growing, we still see the slave trade happening within Africa. So instead of it going across the Atlantic Ocean, which is your 1700s into your early 1800s, what we start to see is that the slave trade begins to focus within African societies. And we still see a continuity of that form of coerced labor. Okay, the last part of industrialization, I know this has been a long lecture, global migration. So there's a need for cheap labor after abolition. So slavery is basically done throughout South America. So your sugar plantations in the West Indies, slavery is done. But there's still sugar plantations that still need laborers. So that labor is going to be filled by migrants, particularly from Asia. And they're going to come in two forms. One, contract labor, where they agree to a contract. They go, I will provide you X amount of labor in exchange for these wages. The other one is indentured servitude. Now, indentured servitude could be considered semi-coerced labor. In other words, sometimes people were signing up and finding themselves suddenly providing much more labor than they were expecting. But indentured servitude is when I say, for 7 years, I will come over and I will provide labor for you. You pay my way, you give me a place to sleep, and you feed me. And in exchange for those three things, I will pay you back with 7 years of labor. And then after 7 years, I'm done. So like contract labor, somebody goes over, works for a short period of time, sometimes returns to their homeland. Indentured servitude, a longer period of time, but once their term is up, they're considered free. And usually those indentured servants end up staying where they are as free people. A lot of this comes from Asian workers, South Asians, East Asians, Filipinos, Japanese. Those are going to be your big groups. And they go to the Americas, they go to Oceania, and they go throughout Africa, particularly in South Africa. So the impact, so what is motivating them to leave? One, there's political disruptions within their homeland. So the idea is that there's this political disruption in Japan. There's an overpopulation. And the Japanese government is saying, I need you guys to get out. So this is part of the Meiji reforms. In China, you have revolutions happening, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion. This is going to encourage a lot of people to get out. So political disruptions and economic opportunities is another reason. There's just more money to be made somewhere else. And the types of labor usually are plantation labor. And for example, if you see a Japanese migrant in Hawaii, they're probably working on a sugar plantation. If you see a Chinese immigrant working in the Western United States, they're probably working on a railroad. If you see an Indian working in South Africa, they're probably working in the mines. So mining, railroad construction, plantations, they're all growing. And they're in Africa, they're all over the place. That's where the labor is going to. European workers coming to the Americas and settled colonies like Australia and New Zealand. One, you think about the Irish, for example, coming over because of the famine or the potato famine. So the potato famine of Ireland, or the Irish potato famine is the technical name, is going to provoke a lot of, or motivate a lot of Irish to leave and come to the United States because there's more economic opportunity. We also have Italians and other East Europeans, Italians, Germans, Polish, Russians. You have a large segment of East Europe coming to the United States and to South America to provide labor in the factories. So Argentina actually wrote into their constitution that they would extend citizenship rights to incoming immigrants. So you're going to see a lot of Italians ending up in Argentina. Um, the effects of the global migration, one, we have the creation of ethnic enclaves. When we think of ethnic enclaves, we think of communities of these immigrants coming together. So you go to New York and you see Little Italy. You go to San Francisco and you see Chinatown. So this idea that the immigrants are going to come together to create their own little communities, and that's going to lead to cultural diffusion. Elements of their culture are going to come to influence the receiving society they've come into. Why do we celebrate St. Patrick's Day as an American holiday? Because of the arrival of the Irish immigrants. Why do we have Italian restaurants all over the place, especially in New York? Because of the arrival of the Italian immigrants. Why do we have Chinese restaurants everywhere? This is examples of cultural diffusion, not just in food, but also in music and also in holidays. But that's the nice way of looking at it. The reality is that there is a lot of discrimination and rejection from the receiving societies of these incoming populations. So the migrant population was seen often as a threat, and therefore you're going to see laws passed to try and limit the immigration. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States says it is exactly what it says it is. It is an attempt to keep the Chinese out of the United States, to limit the immigration. And then in Australia, the attempt to limit non-Europeans coming into Australia is referred to as the White Australian Policy, which was an attempt to keep Australian European and to prevent Asian populations from coming into Australia. And then the last thing is just talk about the widespread discrimination against these groups of people. And one thing that I should add back to number one, the ethnic enclaves, often around urban areas. So that's something else to keep in mind. Like Little Italy, New York City. You know, Buenos Aires in Argentina, that's where you're going to see your Italian ethnic enclave. Chinatown, right around San Francisco. So usually these ethnic enclaves are going to be associated with cities. All right, the last thing is causation. One of the big skills is the causation during the imperial age. So the idea is that imperialism is going to allow for liberal ideas of the Enlightenment to spread to different parts of the globe. So this idea of social contract is going to suddenly find itself having an audience in South Asia, in Vietnam, throughout Africa. And that's going to plant the seeds for future revolutions. So when we look at revolutions in the 20th century, when Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam argues that Vietnam should be able to break away from France, he pulls out the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The creation of nationalism in colonial states. Part of the resistance is going to create a sense of, common ethnicity, common identity, common language, common history, and that's going to create the basis for future nations and an idea of nationalism that is being defined as a rejection of the West and a preservation of traditional values. Within the colonial powers, this imperialism and industrialism is going to create for a better standard of living in Germany, in France, in Britain, in the United States. By 1900, people are living much better across the board than they were in 1800 because of them benefiting from this global economy. The migration of peoples on global scale. The idea is that with steamboats and railroads, we can move people across the globe much more easily. And now we're starting to create new ethnic mixes of population, new ethnic diversity all throughout the globe. So we're going to find South Asian Indians in South Africa and in Uganda. You're going to find South Asian populations ending up in Fiji, which is going to create a tension with the receiving societies. And then lastly, the global wealth disparity. By 1900, most of the global wealth is concentrated within Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. And then you have these underdeveloped nations that do not share as much wealth. And we're creating this idea, there's developed nations and there's underdeveloped nations. And today, we still have this global wealth disparity, where a great deal of the wealth is concentrated in the West European, United States, Japan. You can throw China in there as a developing economy. You can throw Russia in as a developing. So things are changing, but the idea that wealth is connected with industrialization is certainly a change that we're going to see during this time. So that is time period 3. There's a lot of information that I went over. If you watch this all the way to the end, great job. As always, you can email me with any questions or comments, and I will see you for the 4th time period soon. Bye.